Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Tim Huxley, Executive Director of the Asia Office of the International Institute for Strategic Studies here in Singapore. It's a really great pleasure to welcome you to the 36th IISS Fullerton Lecture, which will be delivered shortly by Admiral Phil Davidson, the Commander of United States Indo-Pacific Command. I'd like to welcome not just our established friends amongst you here in the audience this evening, but also those guests who haven't attended one of our IISS Fullerton Lectures or any other IISS events before. It's always a pleasure to see some new faces here. Thank you very much for your participation. It's wonderful to see such a large audience here. For the benefit of those who may be watching this Fullerton Lecture remotely, I should say that we're holding this event in the ballroom of the historic and rather imposing Fullerton Hotel, located in the heart of Singapore's financial district, close to the IISS Asia office in Raffles Place. As I always say at the beginning of these lectures, the spirit and purpose of this distinguished lecture series is to promote informed and intelligent debate in Singapore and beyond on matters of international importance from an international perspective. The first Fullerton Lecture was delivered here in 2012 by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and since then a succession of presidents, prime ministers, cabinet ministers, and other movers and shakers in international affairs has spoken from this platform. In October 2017, Admiral Harry Harris, then US PACOM commander, spoke in this series. We're highly honored this evening that Admiral Davidson is with us as our Fullerton lecturer. Since May last year, he's been commander of America's oldest and largest military combatant command, with its 380,000 military and civilian personnel, and he's responsible for all US military activities across the enormous Indo-Pacific region. He is a surface warfare officer by training and experience, and is a graduate of the United States Naval Academy and the US Naval War College, the latter with distinction. Before moving to Hawaii to take command of US Indo-PACOM, which was renamed from US Pacific Command as he took over, he served as commander of the US Sixth Fleet and commander of NATO's naval striking and support forces in Europe. The topic that Admiral Davidson will address this evening, ensuring a free and open Indo-Pacific, is a really vital one, not only for those of us who are concerned with the making of security policy in this region, but also in terms of the implications of this doctrine for all who live in this region. Over the last year, this doctrine has become the centerpiece of US policy towards Asia, as well as for US allies, notably Japan. Few could speak with more authority on this topic than the United States Regional Military Commander, and I'm sure I speak for our audience, as well as myself, Admiral Davidson, when I say that we look forward greatly to hearing your perspective on the meaning of a free and open Indo-Pacific and how it can best be assured. Admiral, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Huxley, for the very, very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, ministers, permanent secretaries, members of the Diplomatic Corps, the Armed Forces, distinguished guests and friends, good evening. It is my distinct honor to deliver the 36th Fullerton Lecture in the iconic Fullerton Hotel this evening. I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss the importance of ensuring a free and open Indo-Pacific and how the men and women of US Indo-Pacific Command are working alongside our allies, our partners, and our friends to manage challenges, address crises, prevent conflict, and indeed ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific well into the future. I intend to speak a bit more than just about the security domain, because the United States is also increasingly tying together a whole-of-government approach to address Indo-Pacific challenges, and we are absolutely looking to enhance our partnerships with all countries, big and small. But before we begin, I would like to thank Dr. Huxley, Alex Neal, Dr. William Chung, and the entire IISS staff for inviting me to deliver this evening's Fullerton Lecture. I enjoyed our conversation a few moments ago, Tim, and I look forward to continuing our relationship. It does not escape me that this building has been both sentry and bellwether to the political, economic, and social tides of change from 1928 through colonialism, World War II, independence, the Cold War, and now the 21st century modernization we see today. I must also note the astounding development trajectory of the self-ascribed little red dot at the tip of the Malay Peninsula. From its founding 200 years ago to the economic and political marvel that is the powerful city-state of Singapore today, it is truly an astounding trajectory. This is, after all, a city-state that is economically dependent on trade and open commons for its livelihood, and a city-state firmly defended by the strength, might, and power of the Singapore Armed Forces and the Ministry of Defense, who I've been meeting with here this week, and all made just a little bit more powerful with the announcement of the nation's F-35 intentions just this past week. So congratulations to Singapore and the Singapore Armed Forces. Singapore is the second largest port in the world, and one could argue home to the most vital transit point in the world, connecting the Indian and Pacific Oceans through the Straits of Malacca. Indeed, I often joke that Singapore puts the dash between Indo-Pacific. And I would be remiss if I did not add that I learned from a Singapore diplomat here the importance of Singapore and the geography of the Indo-Pacific. Without the Suez Canal, you could argue easily that Singapore would not be what it is today. If you go backwards, the trip around the south of Africa took you through the Sunda Strait, and north. It is the power of the Strait of Hormuz and the Suez Canal that makes Singapore what it is today, and I think guarantees it well into the future. In all, I'm thankful for this opportunity to communicate our ongoing efforts, especially given all that has taken place in the region over the last 2 weeks, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in just a moment. Now, you may recall President Trump announced a vision, or end state, for a free and open Indo-Pacific when he traveled to the region in late 2017. Vice President Pence, Secretary of State Pompeo, Secretary Mattis, and others have further defined that vision since then. And while the term free and open Indo-Pacific is new, the underlying values and principles to which the vision speaks, I would argue, are not. In fact, this is how the U.S. has approached this region throughout our 240-plus year history. Further, we are seeing now a general convergence around the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, or as Singapore might say, a free, open, and inclusive regional architecture. Just this past year, speaking here in Singapore, Indian Prime Minister Modi affirmed India's vision for the Indo-Pacific as a free, open, and inclusive region as part of India's Act East policy. Japan, Australia, and New Zealand have all put forth similar concepts or visions, and Indonesia is leading an effort within ASEAN to elaborate one as well. Although there are some differences in how this vision is communicated, there is growing agreement on how to define a free and open Indo-Pacific and the principles of freedom, sovereignty, and openness. When we say free, we mean both in terms of security, being free from coercion by other nations, and in terms of values and political systems. Free societies respect individual rights and liberties, the promotion of good governance, and adherence to the shared values of the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Free means nations do not have to choose who they trade with and who they partner with because of fear or coercion. They are free instead to exercise their sovereignty and free to exercise their choice. An open Indo-Pacific means we believe all nations should enjoy unfettered access to the international seas and airways upon which our people and economies depend. Open includes open investment environments, transparent agreements between nations, protection of intellectual property rights, and fair and reciprocal trade, all of which are essential for people, goods, and capital to move across borders to the shared benefit of all. This convergence around the principles of a free and open Indo-Pacific is needed to maintain prosperity and to prevent conflict. I believe we saw a clear indicator of this at the end of the G20 summit in Buenos Aires in November, when President Trump, Prime Minister Modi, and Prime Minister Abe met to discuss shared views of the Indo-Pacific. This landmark US, India, Japan meeting clearly highlighted the possibilities for strengthening the foundation of a free and open Indo-Pacific through cooperative advancement of shared values, principles, and common interests. And as we think about the potential for this future, it is important to reflect on the recent past. You have heard me say more than once, for more than 70 years, the Indo-Pacific has been largely peaceful. This was made possible by two things. First, the willingness and commitment of free nations to work together in the rules-based international order. And second, the credibility of the combat power resident within US Indo-Pacific Command now, but most importantly, working alongside the militaries of allies and partners. This commitment and this credibility have worked to liberate hundreds of millions as well as literally lift billions of people out of poverty, all to a level of prosperity previously unseen in human history. And for the United States, this commitment and this credibility remain as firm as ever. We are here as your partners for the long term. You all are very aware of our military presence in the region, but it bears mentioning as our commitment continues today. 60% of the United States Navy forces, ships, are here in the Indo-Pacific. 55% of United States Army forces. 2/3 of our United States Marine forces are in the Indo-Pacific, and we are soon to have 60% of the nation's total tactical aviation assets. Additionally, the United States holds some 90 named military exercises in the Indo-Pacific each year. The vast majority of these exercises are conducted jointly and or combined with our partners and allies. These forces and these exercises work with militaries from across the region in everything from real-time humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, for example, support to damage in Saipan and Tinian in the wake of Typhoon Yutu by US forces. Support by international forces to Indonesia in the wake of the earthquake and tsunami in Sulawesi this past year. And of course, US support to the Thai cave soccer team rescue that happened just several months ago. That is on one end of the spectrum, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, but it moves all the way up to the full spectrum of conventional warfare skills that we need to exercise to deter our adversaries. But the United States is more than a security partner in this region. The United States is also the largest foreign direct investor in ASEAN, with roughly $306 billion in cumulative investment. That is more than the US investment in China, India, South Korea, and Japan combined. I will say that again. The United States foreign direct investment in ASEAN, $306 billion, more than our combined foreign direct investment that goes into China, India, South Korea, and Japan combined. The United States is ASEAN's third largest trading partner. For the United States, the 10 nations of ASEAN taken together would be our fourth largest trading partner for goods. US-ASEAN bilateral trade has increased 78% in the last 15 years, from $153 billion in 2004 to $273 billion last year, and annually grew at a rate of 5%. The United States also has a free trade agreement with Singapore and maintains bilateral trade and investment framework agreements with Malaysia, Burma, Indonesia, Brunei, Laos, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. So whether we are talking about our security or our economic interests, the United States continues to demonstrate the staying power that makes us an enduring power in the region. So indeed, we are a Pacific nation in every sense of the word. For those who may continue to doubt our commitment to ensuring strategic stability, security, and prosperity for our partners and for the broader Indo-Pacific today, tomorrow, and long into the future, let me review some calendar entries from U.S. engagement over the last 2 weeks alone. As you have all heard, there was a summit recently in Vietnam. I want to tell you, we invested to accomplish something big. And after 3 weeks of direct working level negotiations between the United States and the DPRK, President Trump personally holding several hours of negotiations supported by the Secretary of State, our National Security Advisor, Special Representative Began, and more. While we did not reach an agreement with the DPRK, we exchanged detailed positions, narrowed the gap on a number of issues, and made clear that the United States still expects final, fully verified denuclearization. We remain ready to engage in constructive negotiation with the DPRK. We remain shoulder to shoulder on the ground with our allies in the Republic of Korea and Japan. We remain united with the international community that UN Security Council sanctions should remain in place and be fully enforced. And we remain tightly knit with partners, friends, and the international community writ large to make sure that happens. Excuse me. As telltale, this very moment, the United States, the Republic of Korea, Japan, and the United Kingdom are operating ships and aircraft in support of UN sanctions enforcement and against ship-to-ship transfers that are supporting the DPRK. We have also received support from Australia, France, New Zealand, and Canada as well, with equipment and/or personnel operating in the Enforcement Coordination Cell in Yokosuka, Japan. This enforcement operation is critical to our diplomatic effort with the DPRK and remains my top tactical priority. That's one. Let me turn now to South Asia. On February 14th, a terrorist attack in Pulwama killed 40 Indian paramilitary forces. An Indian counter-terrorist response in Pakistan followed on February 26th. The crisis that ensued captured the world's attention. And again, the United States invested heavily to help prevent a crisis from escalating and to stand with our partners in countering terrorism. During the crisis, I personally spoke to India's Chief of Defense, Admiral Lamba, 3 times in the past 10 days alone, as recently as last evening, to emphasize our shared goal of peace and security for the region. The Secretary of State and Acting Secretary of Defense, deeply involved in the negotiation with DPRK at the time, engaged repeatedly. Since then, we have made it clear to Pakistan that it must take concrete actions against Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed to decisively and irreversibly address the terrorist activity on their soil. Our words are supported by deeds. Along with France and the United Kingdom, we also propose to have the UN Security Council designate Masood Azhar as a global terrorist, and we continue to press for that to happen. We helped ensure the financial committee to take action against JEM as well. In other words, it is clear that we stand for peace and security with our partners in the Indo-Pacific. Thirdly, let me turn to Southeast Asia, where Secretary Pompeo met with President Duterte and the Foreign Secretary recently in the Philippines. In unambiguous terms, he reaffirmed our commitment to the Mutual Defense Treaty with the Republic of the Philippines. The Philippines, like so many in the region, depends upon free and unobstructed access to the seas, and China's island building and military activities in the South China Sea threaten Philippine sovereignty, security, and economic reality. As such, Secretary Pompeo assured last week, as the South China Sea is part of the Pacific, any armed attack on Philippine forces, aircraft, or public vessels in the South China Sea will trigger mutual defense obligations under Article 4 of our Mutual Defense Treaty. Our steadfast support for our ally is also underscored by President Trump's commitment to defeating radical Islamic terrorism there. When terrorists seized Marawi in 2017, the U.S. responded immediately with military support, as well as with relief and rehabilitation programs, which continue to this day. So for those who question our commitment, it is clear that our engagement is as enduring as the sea itself. Through defense diplomacy, through defense, through diplomacy, through deterrence, and through collective action, we have worked together to assure our allies and partners to manage crises and prevent conflict just in the last 2 weeks alone. I think it demonstrates what a reliable, committed partner, friend, and ally looks like. A friend that is committed to protecting and preserving the incredible multinational, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious tapestry of this very diverse group here in the region and absolutely in front of me tonight. The Indo-Pacific is one of the largest and most diverse regions on Earth. These differences are our strength, and the thousands of miles of ocean and sky between us do not divide us. They are, in fact, the connective elements that bind us together. The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command remains committed to working with all those who share our vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, an inclusive vision that ensures all rise with the tide. As we move forward, there are 3 areas that are key to maintaining the momentum towards a free and open Indo-Pacific. First, we value the substantial and growing role that ASEAN plays in regional and global security. The United States and ASEAN share common principles of a rules-based international order, respect for international law, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. And we continue to seek ways to improve multilateral security engagements and advance stability in the Indo-Pacific. Much as Vice President Pence said last fall, we know that our prosperity, security, and our future are forever intertwined with the institution of ASEAN and its member states in Southeast Asia. ASEAN is at its strongest in preventing conflict and addressing strategic competition when it is united. And we are committed to supporting and advancing the unity and centrality of ASEAN to strengthen and shape the security order. ASEAN remains central to our efforts to ensure peace and underwrite prosperity in the Indo-Pacific, and we are proud of our partnership at every level, past, present, and future. One concrete way we demonstrate that support is through the regional diplomatic mechanisms such as the ASEAN Regional Forum and Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, which are leading the way in disaster planning and mitigation and providing excellent opportunities to share best practices and improve the coordination of disaster relief efforts. I am also looking forward to the ASEAN-US maritime exercise, which will occur later this year, as we continue to build and strengthen our relationships and demonstrate the United States' steadfast commitment to the region. We look forward to further articulation of ASEAN's vision for the future of the Indo-Pacific and what an ASEAN-led, open and inclusive regional architecture might mean. I believe our interests are aligned in this perspective on maintaining relations with all and expanding opportunities for collaboration and cooperation wherever possible. Second, we can use greater interoperability and information sharing to ensure we collectively uphold the principles of a free and open Indo-Pacific. This week, I saw firsthand the power and potential in information sharing when I visited the Information Fusion Center and the Regional Humanitarian Coordination Cell right here in Singapore. There I saw the collaborative contributions of 18 countries, including the People's Republic of China, in addressing maritime security and responding to potential humanitarian crisis response. The Singapore-hosted Information Fusion Center works daily with open source information in the maritime environment. They make sense of this information and share the analysis internationally to address challenges in the maritime environment, like illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, theft, robbery, and piracy at sea, and illegal human trafficking, all in an effort to reduce the frequency of maritime incidents and developing constructive engagements with commercial shipping and sharing the situational awareness it takes to enforce international law. The ASEAN-led Regional Humanitarian Coordination Center works to integrate the military response efforts to natural and man-made disasters to more rapidly provide the urgent supplies, the essential care, and the initial recovery efforts to alleviate human suffering. Through robust collaboration and information sharing with the UN-led multinational coordination cell in the affected country, the RHCC has effectively assisted with a response to the Nepal earthquake in 2014, and recently in the response to the earthquake and tsunami in Sulawesi in Indonesia. In addition to the ASEAN information sharing efforts, the Maritime Security Initiative has been instrumental in helping nations across ASEAN build capacity to monitor their territorial waters and provide intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance in the areas like the Sulu Sea, where partner nations can assist one another address transnational threats. The U.S. Navy has also announced additional efforts to partner with maritime nations to build awareness and enhance the ability of nations to share what could be time-sensitive and vital information, especially in those areas where the sea lanes of communications are most congested and most at risk. I need to add just one additional thought. So let me take a moment to mention Oceania, or the Pacific Island chain, what I like to call the blue continent, and the opportunity we have to help link ASEAN to the Western Hemisphere. While these countries in the Pacific Island chain have rich cultures, they are home to some of the most isolated populations in the world and a large portion of the protein stocks the rest of the world depends upon. By helping these nations manage their resources and secure their EEZs, we can reduce much of the transnational crime that emerges in the form of human trafficking, drug trafficking, and illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. Information sharing means that we trust enough to share what we see and what we sense to contribute to the underlying system that underpins the security of all. True to the axiom that information is power, information sharing provides the power of trust and the power of transparency, the power of possibilities and opportunities, and ultimately the power to change the trajectory of crises and prevent conflict. That is our common cause to collaborate and cooperate, to see, sense, and secure stability of our region. Third, we will use a whole-of-government approach to address regional challenges. It was here in Singapore that Secretary Pompeo made keynote announcements about the future of the United States Overseas Private Investment Corporation, or OPIC, presaging the U.S. BUILD Act and the formation of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. Key developments to better address the infrastructure challenges necessary for sustained economic growth and development in this region, unleashing the strength of private enterprise. The president and CEO of OPIC, David Bohagan, also announced the formation of a trilateral agreement between the United States, Australia, and Japan to discuss opportunities for collaboration on investments in the Indo-Pacific that would build infrastructure, address key development challenges, increase connectivity, and promote economic growth. There is more to come here, absolutely, from both the United States perspective and from the international perspective. But it is clear to us that the power of private enterprise is the key to development in the region. So, if I could just add, many of these broader efforts have been enabled by the tireless diplomacy of Singapore. 2018 was a banner year for Singapore. The historic President Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un Singapore Summit, attending to the responsibilities as chair of ASEAN, are just two. Every major U.S. leader visited this country: President Trump, Vice President Pence, Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Mattis, and a slew of other senior department officials, politicians, and prominent business leaders, to name just a few. And that was just from the United States. It is proof that even small countries have a great role to play in the evolving political, economic, and security architectures of the 21st century. So thank you, Singapore, for your support. Thank you for your support to a free and open Indo-Pacific. In conclusion, the long arc of history will bend towards a free and open Indo-Pacific. A free and open Indo-Pacific that's built on the foundational principles of mutual security, values, and interests, those that underpin the international rules-based order. We will do our part, and we challenge others to do the same to ensure free and open remain the defining characteristics of the Indo-Pacific now and into the future. I thank you very much for your attention tonight. I look forward to your questions and hearing your perspectives, absolutely, hearing your perspectives and how we can work together to collectively address our shared regional challenges. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to the questions in our discussion. Thank you very much.
That's great.
Thank you. Thanks.
Admiral, thank you very much indeed for your excellent Fullerton lecture. It was full of insights, full of nuance. It was rich with detail. I won't attempt to summarize what you said, but some of the important points that struck me were the way that you talked about the various elements of the free and open Indo-Pacific policy, and you went on to outline the scale and complexity of America's military and economic commitments in this region. You then mentioned various specific crises in the region and the role that the U.S. had played in trying to mitigate and manage those crises in over Korea, South Asia, and also in terms of U.S. commitments to the Philippines. And then at the end of your lecture, you talked about key elements looking to the future. You talked about ASEAN, you talked about interoperability. So you covered a lot of ground. It was very stimulating, and I think there'll be a lot of questions. But before we turn to the audience, maybe if it's all right with you, maybe I could ask you about one or two things that have been on my mind. In your lecture, you did touch on Korea. You talked particularly about the importance of sanctions against North Korea and the enforcement of those sanctions, the multinational effort. I think we're all aware of the outcome of last week's summit in Hanoi between your president and North Korea's leader. But there have also been reports this week that North Korea is restoring facilities at one of its missile launch sites, a missile launch site that had previously been dismantled. That seems to be a very worrying sign. Could you possibly comment on what you see as the potential implications of that?
Yeah, certainly. First, we're well aware of those reports, and they are initial reports at this point. And I think, to lead to a conclusion, I need to let the intelligence community get through its analysis and get there. I would add, though, that the readiness of the United States and forces absolutely are key in my mind right now, as well as General Abrams. And we're keeping a close watch on developments that might occur. I testified just a couple of weeks ago in full support of the intelligence community's position. But the fact of the matter is, we've known all along, while we think in the background the development of nuclear capability and missile capability continues in North Korea. What we have not been seeing is missiles on launch pads or preps for nuclear tests. So we're watching that very, very closely. We maintain the tactical response with our allies and partners in the regions to be able to respond to that should tensions go up. But I need to let the intelligence community complete its analysis before we speak more about it.
Thank you very much. And something else that I think is very much on the minds of people who are interested in regional security has been the continuing increase in Chinese activities, military activities in the South China Sea. And I think you've commented on that recently. But again, I think it would be very interesting for our audience here if you might say something about how you view that trend of increasing Chinese activities in the South China Sea, and related to that, the question of how should the United States, allies of the US, and security partners respond to that?
Certainly we're seeing an increase in activity in naval and air forces across the South China Sea from China. It has gone up, I would say, noticeably in every year over the last several years. I would also add that we're seeing an increase in the PLA's activities around the globe at a pace that has been increasing over the last several years as well. I'd say just in the last few months alone, we've seen an uptick in the amount of fighter operations that have been happening over the South China Sea, as well as bomber operations that China employs. In terms of the response, I think it's important that the response to China's activities be an international response. This is indeed about the rules-based international order and the free seas and skies over the South China Sea that support not just the United States economy and security and prosperity, but really the prosperity and security of all the nations on the South China Sea, but really across the whole of the Indo-Pacific. I won't repeat here today, the staggering, trade numbers and all that stuff, but I will add one factor that people don't think about. So often the conversation in the South China Sea is about two destroyers, passing, within the 9-dash line. The fact of the matter is the trade, and very importantly, the financial information that travels on the cables underneath the South China Sea is critical to the economy of not only the United States, but certainly this country and all the ASEAN countries as well. We really need to think about the South China Sea in terms of its use as commons, from the bottom of the sea to space overhead and everything that's traveling through there, and how important it is to our collective prosperity and security.
Thank you very much, Admiral. We'll now turn to our audience who will have their chance to ask questions. Could anyone who'd like to ask a question please raise your hand? When I identify you, the microphone will come to you. Then if you could please say who you are, what your affiliation is, and then ask your question with a question mark at the end, please, and please keep your question fairly brief. Aaron Connolly from the IISS.
Thanks for your remarks, Admiral. Wanted to ask you a question about force structure around the South China Sea. You've mentioned the increase in PLA, Air Force fighter and bomber operations in that area, and the need for it to be an international response. I'm wondering, what can IndoPACOM do to ensure that the United States Philippine allies are involved in that response to speed along the production of these EDCA facilities that were agreed in 2015? And then what are the breaks? What's preventing the U.S. from doing more with Vietnam? There seems to be slow movement on that front, but what's preventing that from going faster? Thank you.
Well, to the point about the Philippines, I think we had the groundbreaking for the first EDCA agreed site just in the last 60 days or so. And I think that's an important part of our relationship going forward. I would just say that our military-to-military relationship with the Philippines has been accelerating really during the course of the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the PNP SAF's very brave battle in Marawi City, which I remind people all the time is no village. It was a city of 200,000 people that was under siege by ISIS in the Philippines. And our mill-to-mill relationship has greatly advanced since then. you know, we are moving forward on the EDCA projects. We have a solid relationship burgeoning, and I expect it will continue. To your second point, and you'll have to remind me, Aaron. Vietnam, yes, I'm sorry. There is absolutely opportunity there. A lot of our, Vietnam is the most vocal supporter of our freedom of navigation operations and the international community's broader operations in the South China Sea. As with all things, it's a new relationship, and these things take some time. I'm interested in advancing the relationship as quickly as their bandwidth will allow, and I look forward to making a visit there myself come April.
Mr. Surya from the Institute of South Asian Studies.
I'm Surya from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. I moved over to RSIS. Admiral, it was a wonderful presentation by you, a comprehensive summary of the activities of the US and other countries under the Indo-Pacific rubric. But there was one missing element. You didn't mention anything about Quad. Is Quad relevant at all to Indo-Pacific military dimension or not at all? And secondly, you said you were in communication with the Indian Navy during the current simmering crisis between India and Pakistan. Is there any possibility of practical cooperation between US and India in terms of meeting the current simmering crisis in South Asia? Thank you.
Submarine crisis, you said?
Simmering
crisis in South Asia. Yes, thank you. To your point about a missing element and the Quad, we absolutely seek to cooperate with all those nations and more. I sat a panel at the Raisina Dialogue with Admiral Lamba, the Chief of Defense in India, General Campbell, the Chief of Defense in Australia, Admiral Kawano, the Chief of Defense in Japan, as well as the French Navy Chief of Service as well. And the issue of a Quad came up several times. Admiral Lamba made quite clear that there wasn't an immediate potential for a Quad. That does not omit or prevent our ability to cooperate in crisis and conflict. And we continue collectively, all of us, to seek opportunities in which we might exercise and work together going forward. But I'll leave the issue of a Quad to Admiral Lamba and what he had to say about it. As far as our own relationship with India is concerned, we have a burgeoning relationship. We had some breakthroughs last year. The CATSA waiver was one discussion, but most importantly was the COMCASA. And we're working quite hard now to operate. The COMCASA was an agreement to share technology tools. We're working very hard right now within Indo-Pacific Command and at the Pacific Fleet Headquarters to operationalize that in the form of a flyaway operational planning tool so that we can coordinate in tactical prosecutions at sea, as well as to have a more persistent operational, I meant tactical tool there, but as a more persistent operational planning tool in which we can coordinate and collaborate on things in advance. To the point about assisting in the current crisis, I'm certainly made Admiral Lamba aware of US operations in the theater. The John C. Stennis just went through the Strait of Malacca here in the last 48 hours or so and is in the Indian Ocean. I think that lends assurance really to both sides, India and Pakistan. And we welcome advancing our tactical relationship with India at any time. I'll add just one more point. India sent a ship to RIMPAC, the very major exercise we have in even years last year. They were a phenomenal performer in the exercise, both during the import phase and during the underway phase. It speaks to the relationship that's burgeoning to the two of us and the capability that the Indian Navy actually possesses. I was really impressed with their performance at RIMPAC.
Mr. Alex So.
From Asian Chartered Business. Just a question, in view of the humanitarian area, should there be a weather crisis or ecological or natural disaster, or even maybe a terrorist activity, intense terrorist activity within your area of command, how is your response to such events in time? Would you respond immediately, or would there be a delay as according to decision made from your political structure?
Yeah, one of the benefits of the 380,000 men and women that work for Indo-Pacific Command is I have immediate access to those forces. Certainly there's a diplomatic element in which a state has to request assistance. I can tell you in the 3 examples I cited earlier in my speech that we lent last year, we called right away to say what we had that was capable and moved it quite quickly. We had forces moving to Thailand for the soccer team rescue in the cave within 24 hours of it even appearing on the news immediately. We have a lot of flexibility there.
Another Alex Neil.
Thanks very much, Tim. A question about ship-to-ship transfers across the Indo-Pacific. I know this has become a focus, particularly with regard to sanctions enforcement against the DPRK. Admiral, do you think enough is being done across the Indo-Pacific to prevent such illicit ship-to-ship transfers?
I have to say yes. You know, at the heart of any sanctions effort is the diplomatic, treasury, legal enforcement mechanisms that must follow with an effort like that. And I can tell you the international community has responded to our identification of illicit ship-to-ship transfers across the globe in a way that I think shows the collective respect and support for those sanctions regimes. Whether it's been nations' need to deflag vessels, impound vessels, seize cargo, we have seen it from here to the Western Hemisphere. So I'm pretty pleased with that. Can more be done? It's a very difficult operational and tactical space. There are literally hundreds of licit ship-to-ship transfers that are happening in those areas of the world on a day-to-day basis. Ship companies, oil brokers, things like that do it for a lot of reasons, one of which is to avoid port costs. It makes the sort in all this genuinely difficult, and by that I mean, you know, how we observe it in the tactical space. But I'm actually quite pleased with the response of the international community whenever we report illicit transfers.
Thank you. Admiral, before you, immediately before you came to this region, you were commander of the Sixth Fleet, and you also had a role in NATO. You've over the last year or so, you've been in a very different region, a region without the sort of firm multinational security structures that exist in the Euro-Atlantic sphere. Clearly, this region is very different in terms of history and culture and political dynamics, which explains that. You talked in your Fullerton lecture at one point about the importance of ASEAN and ASEAN being strongest when it's most united. Of course, ASEAN is not an alliance structure, but within this region, it is the closest thing that there is to at least a political alliance among states. What do you see as the future of more coordinated security and defense collaboration in this region.
Let me be quite forthright, Tim. If you're asking me, do I see an alliance structure in NATO, or NATO-like alliance structure with a military component, a political component, working hand in hand in the near term, I don't. Certainly not during my time as the Indo-Pacific Command Commander, and I would say for several years to come. One of the things I talked about in the speech, though, was getting after information sharing. One of the benefits of NATO is the collective response and the transparency and surety and confidence that they put in neighbor-to-neighbor relations. Much of the backbone of that, before you get to the military and the political apparatus, is the ability to trust each other. And I think in this region, we'll start on that journey of collaboration with greater trust and transparency in our information sharing. Even when it's open source information, which is the two coordination centers I talked about here in Singapore. It builds a level of collaboration and cooperation inside the little headquarters that's supporting that. I mentioned there were 18 different nations represented in the one. But it also starts to build the kind of understanding and situational awareness of what each other's concerns are, as neighbors, or on the seas that might connect the two of them. And I truly think that that's the way ahead. We're working hard. I mentioned several of those collaborative efforts to get after that. The political piece absolutely has to happen, and that was the first effort in NATO. And ASEAN unity going forward is going to have to be the backbone of any kind of alliance structure that were to come to pass. So.
Thank you very much. William Chung.
Hi, Admiral. William Chung from the IISS. I think you can hear me, but you can't see me because
yes.
I'm right at the side here. So I think we've got about 8 minutes, and I'm going to go for a double question here. So first question, when defense ministers at Shangri-La Dialogue talk about the rules-based international order or rules-based international system, I think most policymakers in the region don't have a problem with that when you talk about a free and open Indo-Pacific. But if you talk to the Chinese, I think there's an institutional cringe when the term is mentioned in public fora, because obviously, some definitions of free societies, open sea lanes, the Chinese see it as a direct challenge to what they are doing in the South China Sea. So my question for you is, how do you think you can kind of get the Chinese to thinking the way you think or the way we think about the rules-based international system? That's the first question.
Will you stop there?
All right.
Give me a chance to. Well, I might filibuster myself to the second question. I think one of the key beneficiaries of the rules-based international order so far has indeed been China, and the understanding that the open seas and skyways is what made the trade, manufacturing, financial flows, business exchange possible in their lifetime, really without any external threat that was evident from the international sea or airspace, is the realization that China has to have going forward. I think their paranoia about a free and open Indo-Pacific when it comes to wanting to be a participant is misplaced. I do think that their desire is actually to supplant the rules-based international order and replace it with one of their own. And they frequently talk about having a rules-based order that's led by one with Chinese characteristics. And I think for those of us who are dependent on the free and open order, I think that's a chilling proposal. How would a how would an environment in which people value the free and open principles that I described be led by a country that has a closed and authoritarian internal order? It's a bit of a mystery to me. Back to you.
Thank you. I'm enjoying this. Thanks. Second question. So, like I mentioned, I spent a week in Seoul, and one issue that worries me is actually the kind of tensions that we see between two very close allies of the United States, the ROK and Japan. And obviously, you know, we can go spend all night talking about the value of these two alliance relationships with the United States. But it seems like at the current moment, the ROK has serious problems with Japan, as we see with the P-1 incident in the East China Sea. We see the issue about, you know, the comfort women issue between the ROK and Japan, and, you know, the ROK basically taking a very hard position towards the Japanese. So another worrying thing is we don't seem to hear much from the United States as how we could get, you know, the ROK and Japan to kind of patch up their relationship, or to borrow the words of Lee Kuan Yew, you know, perhaps to knock some heads together and knock some sense into two allies who seem to be behaving somewhat inappropriately. So could you kind of comment on the issue?
Yeah, I have to tell you, the interactions in the battle space between the ships and the maritime patrol aircraft, I've actually engaged repeatedly with both General Park in Korea and Admiral Kawano to help pave the way to preventing miscalculation there in the East China Sea. So I'm quite pleased with that. We had a discussion earlier in private where we talked about all the political season that's ongoing here across many nations in the region. It is indeed election season. One of the symptoms you see that come out of election seasons internationally is reluctance to engage or perhaps comment forthrightly when another nation's elections are going on. And then the domestic politics that are happening, you see people's numbers going on when there's convenient foil to comment on. I think both Japan, absolutely, fully supportive of the free and open Indo-Pacific, and I know in my own private conversations with Korean officials, they see their future in a free and open Indo-Pacific as well. We continue to encourage them at the military level and at the political and diplomatic level to find their way forward. That's going to be a relationship that I think is important for all the democracies in the region.
Admiral, thank you very much. Thank you for your Fullerton Lecture and for your very frank and open answers to these this great range of questions here this evening. I think one takeaway for me from the last hour has been not only the huge extent and complexity of this region where your command plays a vital role as a security balancer in this region, but also the fact that the complexity of this region often involves allies and partners that themselves don't necessarily get on with each other. And the fact that you and your command play an important part in managing those relationships as well. We mentioned Japan and Korea just then, but earlier you talked about India and Pakistan. So your responsibilities and those of your command are huge, and I think you've given us some very important insights into them this evening, and for that we're indebted to you. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Tim. I enjoyed it. Thank you.